Hey, welcome to my channel. If you've watched many of my videos, you know I'm a real fan of historic knives and other items, and I just love finding old knives. And so I was at an antique flea market, and they have these bins, and there's two bins. One bin was just piled full of old pocket knives, it's $5, and the other bin piled full of old knives is $12. And obviously the $12 ones are a little bit nicer than the $5 ones, but sometimes you find a treasure in on either side. So I was in there rummaging around the other day, and I found a couple of old Boker knives. One of them is a 280 Whittler that I'll probably show in a future video, and the other one was this Boker Congress. Now the Congress is kind of a knife. I've never had one before. They're kind of sway-backed, and they have 4 blades. What's interesting is that 2 of the blades are sheepfoot blades, and we'll look at this more closely on the bench, but 2 of them are identical, and then there's a pin blade and a coping blade, which is kind of like a little tiny horn clip blade. So the history of this is kind of neat, and we're going to talk about all of that. I found this thing, it was pretty rusty, and the medallion was missing, and there was a chip missing out of the scales, and this is kind of a story of how I kind of brought this thing back to life. Now, I haven't tried to restore this back to like new condition. It's got way too much wear on the scales and stuff to really ever do that. What I wanted to do is turn it back to a usable condition, one that honored its history and, you know, the life that it's led up till now. And now that I've fixed it up, you know, it's got a new life ahead of it. I really wish this old thing could talk. You know, I'm fascinated about these kind of things because, you know, there's somebody used this a lot. The scales are pretty polished on it, pretty worn, and you know they're plastic, but somebody used this thing a lot. And when you see the close-up pictures of the blades and stuff, you'll see that this knife was one, you know, probably some farmer, somebody used quite a bit, and it had quite a life. And so we're going to put this in the workbench, let you take a look at it. We'll talk about the history of the Congress knife and what that's about, and let's get started. Hey, before we do, if you would, please click on the like and subscribe buttons. That really helps. Let's take a look at this thing. Okay, so this is the Boker Congress, and this is the first Congress I've ever had. It's kind of a unique design. Like I say, it's sway-backed. You can see this kind of arch in the design. It's got 4 blades. There's 2 sheep's foot blades that are basically identical, and then there is a pin blade and a coping blade. The kind of history of this knife is that it starts off as an American design in the early 1800s. As I understand it, that this knife was popular in what's known as the antebellum South, which would have been in between the wars, you know, after the War of 1812 and before the Civil War. That time period is when this knife started becoming popular. And it was popular with tobacco and cotton farmers. Evidently there's some pretty specific things they did with them. And the reason that the 2 main blades are identical is that whatever they did with those 2 blades, this basically allowed them to work twice as long before they had to stop and sharpen the knife. And so the idea behind these 2 identical blades is that you could work longer. Now, the name Congress actually has to do with those 2 blades. It's the idea behind the name Congress is that both sides come together, right? So, like our Congress is supposed to do, which we know they don't do much of that anymore, both sides are supposed to come together, and that's the design of the knife, is the 2 sides coming together. So, you know, it'd be nice if our Congress could come together and reach some consensus, but that doesn't seem to happen much anymore. Anyway, that's kind of the, you know, as I understand it, just the research I've done, that's kind of the history of the name. This is a Boker, which is made in Solingen, Germany. I know there are some U.S.-made Bokers. This one, if you look at the tang stamp and the design of the tang stamp, and this one actually has umlauts. I don't think I can get it close enough to see this, but it actually has umlauts over the O in Boker. They're really kind of hard to see. But this tang stamp evidently indicates that tang stamp was used between 1891 and 1944, but the umlauts over the O in Boker started in 1932. So presumably this knife was made between 1932 and 1944. Now, we know with the starting of World War I and probably by even 1939, maybe 1940, 41, somewhere in there, these weren't being imported anymore. There could have been some on the stores, on the shelves in stores. So, the greatest likelihood that this knife was, purchased by somebody, I mean, assuming it didn't come from Germany with somebody coming from Europe. If it was bought in the United States, it was probably purchased between 1932 and say 1940, 41, somewhere in there. With 1941, the start of World War II, obviously they weren't importing any more of these. This knife was in pretty rough shape. But I felt like it would be salvageable. So I wrote an email to Boker USA, and they very kindly sent me a new medallion. So this new medallion obviously isn't like the original. It's I'm sure a different. I'm not really sure. I know the original one did have a tree because it's Boker, but it may have said Solingen or something like that on it. I'm really not sure exactly. I haven't been able to find an exact picture of this knife online. I've seen some that are close, but not exactly this one. And this one has the 3 rings on each end, or these grooves in the bolsters. The nice thing about this knife is that the blades are nice and snug. There wasn't any wobble in them. It's really, in terms of mechanical condition, it was still pretty solid. So I want to show you some of what I did to kind of bring this thing back to life. Now, one thing I didn't videotape. I'm going to show you if I can get close here and see if you can see it. I filled this chip down here, and what I did is I mixed some epoxy with some. It's actually a colorant that you use for like finishes like paint or clear finishes to tint them, but it's called Mixol, and you can get it at woodworking stores or online. It comes in little bottles, and just a few drops in a little bit of epoxy allowed me to make the epoxy match this. I used just called a dark brown Mixol. So what it is, I really just put a piece of heavy masking tape along the back of the knife here, and then filled that space with the epoxy. Now, let me back up. Before I did that, I went in and cleaned, first with a little wire brush and then some sandpaper. I cleaned all the grunge out of this space and then roughed up the brass liner and the plastic, the edges of the scale where it was broken away. I roughed those up with sandpaper, some 220 grit sandpaper. That would allow the epoxy to attach or adhere better. And I made this tape dam on here, filled it with the epoxy, and then carefully, first with a knife, just kind of carved it back down to shape, and then some fine sandpaper. Now you can see it's not as shiny as the rest of the plastic, and that's because this epoxy, I think partly because the Mixol affects how fast it hardens. It's 5-minute epoxy or 15-minute epoxy. It's fast drying epoxy, but it's a few days out now, and it's probably starting to get hard enough I could actually polish this. So I'll probably literally just wait a few weeks or a month, and this will be hard enough I can go in here and try to polish it so that it kind of has a similar sheen as the scales. But that allowed me to fill that gap up. Anyway, I want to show you how I straightened up the blades. I wanted to show you how I straightened up the blades on this knife. You saw from the picture that the blades were pretty concave. One of them had a big notch in the end of it. So they've been kind of abused a bit, but there was still plenty of steel that I could straighten them out. And as you can see here, I've got the 2 sheep's foot blades nice and straight. And the pin blade is nice and straight now. And this blade, the coping blade, is also nice and straight. And I was able to do that. There was enough steel I could do it and not make the blades look too wonky that they wouldn't close properly or whatever. So anyway, I wanted to show you this. I'm using a little, I'm going to zoom out just a bit here, a little Harbor Freight. You've seen these probably in other videos. It's just a little Harbor Freight tabletop belt sander. So 1 by 32, I think it is, inch belt sander. And I wanted to show you how I do this a little bit so that you could see. I decided not to do it with the sander running because you wouldn't be able to hear me talk with this thing running because it's kind of noisy. And I thought I could better illustrate how I clean these blades up. So here's what I did. When the blade was concave, I actually started first just perpendicular to the belt, working on the high spots. So not here in the middle where it was dished out, but I would kind of work on this end a little bit, work on this end a little bit, and then get it where I could get a nice flat, straight flat on the edge of the blade. And I could see, the flat all the way from end to end on the blade. Of course, it was a little thinner at the center because the blade had been dished, but that's fine as long as there was just an even flat, a flat area all the way the length of the blade, and so I knew it was straight, right? Then, holding the blade at about a 12-degree angle. I like a pretty shallow angle on a knife I'm going to use for whittling. I very quickly came across and would establish the edge on it. Then I would have to turn the blade around and do it from the other direction. And then I'm able to bevel the blade, and it's ready now to put on a stone and start sharpening. And I know you can actually sharpen with one of these, but I don't really like doing that. Amazingly, it's actually a pretty sharp feeling edge, but being from a 400 grit belt on a sander like this, it's a little coarse. So anyway, I was able to get these nice and straight, so they'll sharpen up nicely on a stone. Now, a couple of things you need to understand about this kind of belt sander. These things really run way too fast for knife work. You have to be very quick on the belt. So as I did this, after just about every pass on this belt, I'm dipping this blade in a cup of water to cool it off. And when I did the bevels, again, I just come straight across the blade pretty quickly and cool the blade, quench it, and do that. If you ever turn the blade steel blue, you've overheated it. And then the temper's gone and you've effectively ruined it. So you have to be very quick on the belt, very light touch on the belt, and you never stop in one spot, ever, because you'll overheat the steel. And so it's very important that you work very quickly across the belt. If the steel feels warm at all, quench it. Go from the other direction, get your bevel established. But you really just don't ever stop. You just come across, all the way across the belt, and so you never stop with any part of the blade still running on that belt, because it'll A, grind off too much, and B, it'll overheat the steel. I wish there was a way to put a speed control on this motor. I haven't really explored that. I'm not thinking it is. I think it's an induction motor. But this thing it really runs too fast for knife work. So, but still, you can use it. You just have to be very careful. And so that's how I straightened up the blades on this Boker Congress. Okay, the next thing I wanted to show you was how I clean some of the rust off the blades. Now, I've done a little bit of work on a couple of them where you can see that the surface rust is gone. There is some pitting that's left, but I really don't want to remove enough material to get all that pitting out. It would mean thinning the blade more than I would like. And I'm like, as a using knife, as opposed to something collecting, I'm okay with that. It's part of the history of the knife, but I don't want to leave surface rust like this. So how am I going to get rid of that? So let me show you what I do. The first thing I do is I get some 400 and 600 grit wet or dry sandpaper. This is 400 grit and this is 600. I'll start with the 400. I'll take a small block of wood. This is just a piece of spruce, and I'll wrap that on there, around there. This is just some lightweight machine oil. Actually, it's Marvel Mystery Oil and sewing machine oil, about a 50-50 mix. I use this for some fine things like lubricating knives. But just any lightweight machine oil. I'll put a little bit of oil on the blade. And then really the thing I do is just, back and forth across the blade. Try to keep the flat of the blade nice and flat. Up near the hinge, I'll actually typically go the other direction. And wipe that off, and you can see it's starting to remove some of the surface rust from it. So I'll keep working with the 400 grit. Until I think I've gotten as much of that surface rust off of there I'm going to get. Like I say, if it leaves some pitting behind, that's really just kind of unavoidable. Unless you want to go to the length of, I mean, you could just keep going on and on and on until you remove it. But like I say, I view knife steel as kind of a resource, and I hate to waste a resource unnecessarily. So, let's do a little work on the other side. But you want to definitely use a little block so you're holding the sandpaper nice and flat on that blade. You don't want to round corners. You want to keep everything nice and flat. And you can see by the way the oil turns black that you're removing, that surface rust and oxidization off the blade. You can also, do the back of the blade. Keep it nice and square. Like I said, oil does turn black as you do it. So anyway, you can start to see that that's cleaning up. The next thing I would do would be just to repeat the process with 600 grit paper. Same block of wood, 600 grit paper. And this knife has enough pitting on it that I'm not going to try to remove all of that. I would just have to remove more metal than I really care to. And okay, yeah, you can definitely see you're removing some gunk off the blade. There's actually a little slight roll or taper at the edge of the blade there on this one side. I'm not sure what that's from, but I could follow that angle, and if it's rusty I could clean that up too. That may have been done so that when you close this blade, it keeps the blade from catching. They probably rolled this top corner on this side just a little bit to keep the other blade from catching it as it closed. Anyway, that's kind of the process. Obviously I need to spend some more time on this in just a few seconds here on the video. But that's basically how I clean up those rusty blades. Again, depending on how much time you want to spend on it, you could even start with like a 320 grit or a 220 grit paper, and then go to the 400, go to 600. You could even go to 800 or 1000 if you want it to polish a little bit more. It's really up to you how much time and effort you want to put on it. My purpose for this knife, as worn as it is, and I don't really want to erase the history of this knife. I'm never going to turn it back into something that looked like it was brand new. So my goal with this one is to clean the surface rust off, get the blades where they're functional, usable, and sharp again, and use this to start whittling with. Okay, well, that's kind of how I got it into this shape, and just really, other than that little Harbor Freight belt sander, it's really just mostly cleaning it up by hand, and getting some lubricant in the joints and working the blades and trying to work some of the old rust out of the joints and flushing some of that lubricant out and replacing it with new, and just trying to clean it up. I had to clean up the inside of it. I had to open all the blades up and get in there with a Actually, I took a little wire brush that was meant for a Dremel tool, and because it's small in diameter, I was able to stick it in there and run it back and forth and clean out the inside of it. Also used a bamboo skewer wrapped in steel wool, stuffed in there, and went back and forth to clean it. So that kind of helped clean out the outside, or the inside. So now I've got a good usable Boker Congress. This is going to be, I think, a favorite whittling knife. The two sheep's foot blades plus that coping blade, I think, are just going to be fantastic for whittling. And that's one of the reasons I think it was popular in the South, because a lot of those people that had these, you know, when the day's work was done and they're sitting on the porch, whittling was a popular pastime. So anyway, that's this Boker Congress. Well, there you go. That's this Boker Congress. It's a really neat knife. And like I said, looking at this on the bench, I'm probably going to use this, you know, probably for a whittling knife, for doing woodworking and, you know, maybe working on musical instruments. The blade designs, I think, will really be a good fit for that. This has had enough of a rough enough life that I don't think making an everyday carry knife, I mean, it would take it, but making an everyday carry knife out of it probably isn't necessary. I think it's just going to be really fun to use it for special projects, you know, whittling and carving projects, things like that. Anyway, I sure appreciate you joining me. If you have any thoughts or questions, please don't hesitate to leave me a comment. And as always, thanks for watching.